again, everyone. So in this video, we're going to briefly discuss the reasons why the US has two dominant political parties. So you may have noticed that the two political parties that we most frequently hear about and the two political parties that are the most powerful in the US, that win the most elections, that have the most registered voters, that have the most financial resources, are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. However, not all democratic countries in the world have only two major parties. So political scientists have asked, a lot over the years. They've wondered, why is it that in some democratic countries, really two major dominant parties emerge and control elections and government, whereas in other countries you see maybe 5 or 6 political parties that are viable and that have a competitive opportunity in elections. So why does the US have a two-party political system? Well, there are a few reasons. The first reason is that electoral rules and political institutions are designed and implemented by members of the two major parties. So, in other words, the Democrats and the Republicans have essentially created the rules of the game for the political system that we live in. And because these two major parties have created the rules of the game, they really benefit from these rules. So we could think about this just in terms of like any game that you like to play, whether it's sports or a computer game or like a game on your phone, like an app. If you were able to rig the game in your favor or to create the rules, write the rules of a game, and you knew that there was a way to do that to give yourself a bit of an advantage over the other players in that game, then you might be tempted to do that so that you can hold on to power and win the game. So it's that same kind of logic that governs this first argument that we get from political scientists about why the US has a two-party political system. This is a way of the two major political parties maintaining power over the political system because they've essentially created the political system. So, of course, they can maintain power over it. So that's the first part of the argument, or the first reason that political scientists propose to explain why the US has only two major dominant political parties. The second reason that political scientists have found that the US has only two major political parties, this second reason is based on electoral institutions within different countries. So, over time, political scientists have found that majoritarian systems are more likely to produce a lesser number of powerful political parties than political systems that use proportional representation. So majoritarian systems and systems of proportional representation are just different ways of designing a democratic country and like structuring or setting up a government. So for example, the US, the UK, France, India, many other nations in the world are majoritarian countries. So in majoritarian countries, the candidate who receives the majority of the votes is declared elected, and whoever else, the other candidate, whoever was running, they just lose the election, right? There's no splitting the proportion of the votes based on the vote share. It's just there's one winner and one loser, and it's based on who wins the majority of the votes. So because of the way that majoritarian systems are set up, they do tend to exclude large sections of public opinion, including minorities and people with loyalty to third parties. So what this means is that sometimes, instead of capturing the opinions of, all Americans, you end up inducing or encouraging people to just choose one of the big major parties, either the Democratic or Republican Party, and instead of choosing a third party. So let's say there was someone who really loved the Green Party, but they don't think the Green Party has a chance of winning an election. So they're probably going to vote for the Democratic Party. We could use the same example with the Libertarian Party and the Republican Party. So there are a lot of passionate libertarians who might consider voting for the Republican Party if they think that their Libertarian Party candidate won't actually win an election. So oftentimes you get voters pushed into a voting position that may not reflect their actual public opinion about the parties. So we can contrast this to systems of proportional representation. I've listed a few examples here of nations that use proportional representation, but the list is so long. If you were to just type into Google countries that use proportional representation or democracies that use proportional representation, the list is incredibly long. There's a lot of geographic variation. So there are countries using PR on almost all the continents except maybe Antarctica. But in proportional representation, political groups receive seats, like seats in a legislature, for example. So political groups receive seats in proportion to their electoral strength, and therefore no single political force retains a monopoly on the political system, as none of the parties is excluded from representation. So in a PR system, instead of having one winner and one loser based on the person who wins the majority of the votes, you instead have representatives from different parties who split the vote share and are allotted a certain number of seats based on the percentage of the vote that they won. So how does this play out in American politics? How does this affect our two-party political system in the U.S.? Now, there was a French political scientist who came up with a theory to describe the ways in which majoritarian systems, as opposed to systems of proportional representation, impact whether or not we see two major political parties or a multitude of major political parties in a nation. This theory is referred to as Duverger's law. So Duverger's law is the theory that elections in majoritarian or plurality voting political systems tend to favor two major political parties, making it very hard for a third party to win. So why are majoritarian systems associated with two-party systems? What did Duverger really mean when he was talking about this theory? So the first point that Duverger made is that weak parties, like third parties in a majoritarian system, such as the Green Party or the Libertarian Party in the US, they have to combine their resources. Sometimes this means combining their resources with other weak parties or other third parties But sometimes this means combining your resources with one of the two major parties, like the Democratic or Republican parties. This is called fusion, as in the fusion of party assets. So the resources here could be facilities, time, people, money, any kind of resources that political parties could use. Weak parties are eventually eliminated when voters abandon the weak parties for the parties that actually have a chance of winning. So I think I gave this example a little bit earlier, but just to reiterate briefly, so for example, if you are a member of the Green Party, but you don't think that the Green Party candidate has a realistic chance at winning an election, maybe you'll vote for the Democratic candidate because you think, oh, well, at least that candidate has a chance. They're not my first choice, but they would be better than the other representative from the Republican Party or the other candidate, So oftentimes people who are members of the weak parties or the third parties will go for a candidate that's in one of the two major dominant parties because they think, well, at least I have a shot at getting some of what I want out of government if that candidate wins. Whereas if the other candidate wins, I won't get anything that I want. So Duverger also predicted that two-party political systems would likely experience intense political polarization. And this is a part of the theory that's definitely played out, especially in the US and the UK and India, all of which are majoritarian systems that have two major dominant political parties. We've seen in the US context a lot of party polarization and political polarization. So what political polarization means is that people on the right and people on the left, or Democrats and Republicans, their positions, their policy positions, and their political values have gotten further and further apart. So there's less and less that people can agree on. So there's not as much that Democrats and Republicans can agree on today than they might have been able to do, 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So over time, political polarization just gets more and more intense and entrenched in a political system when you have a two-party system. So this is what Duverger predicted, and it's really fascinating because most political scientists say, well, this Duverger's law is really had a big effect on American politics, especially recently.